Welcome back to the Lydia Magruder channel. I'm continuing today my series entitled, in a deliberately robust and perhaps provocative way, Development Theories of the Gospels Are All Bunk. Last time I began by talking about development theories of Jesus' passion. I'm going to continue today with some attempts to deal with counter evidence and some further quote-unquote arguments that Jesus reveals a more developed character in the Passion as we move chronologically in the Gospels from earlier to later. And what I want you to see here is just how strained this becomes, this attempt to argue for these things. And when you realize this, you realize that these development theories are really what's driving the bus. The data are not what is driving the bus. And I think I can illustrate that today. So I want to start with two more attempts to argue, quote unquote, that Jesus is more developed, particularly in the Gospel of John, than in the Synoptics in relation to his passion and death. The first of these claims concerns the Last Supper. And it's a vague contrast. It's not always clear if the scholar is saying that the author made something up. Ehrman definitely thinks that John made up the place where Jesus hands the sop to Judas. So that's what this one jumps off from. That incident where the beloved disciple asks Jesus, who is it who's going to betray you? Peter kind of makes the sign, ask him. And the beloved disciple asks, and Jesus says, it's the one to whom I give the sop after dipping. So he dips it, he gives it to Judas Iscariot, and he says, what you're going to do quickly. What you do quickly. And so Ehrman says, see, Jesus is in control of the whole thing. He even tells Judas Iscariot to go do it quickly, and that's not found in the Synoptics. Now, that's pretty silly, pretty obviously lame, because we can even imagine that if you have the least bit of dramatic sense and the least bit of common sense in attributing human psychology to Jesus as well, that you want to get it over with. And you can even see a kind of bitterness there. You're going to go betray me? Go do it. You're going to do it, right? It's not, hey, I'm in control. Okay, the next scene is, you're going to betray me. Chop, chop, let's get going, Move on to the next scene. I'm in control of my death. I mean, that's just a very weird interpretation of this. Now, this is sometimes contrasted with the Synoptics, sometimes just by giving references. And when you go and you read them, these are references to the place in the Synoptics where Jesus says something like this. I'm going to give a pretty literal translation here from each of the Synoptics of what I think is the same saying, just worded somewhat differently. Mark 14:20, it is one of the 12 who is dipping with me in the one bowl. Okay? So, well, I'll move on. All right. Luke 22:21, the hand of him betraying me is with me on the table. Okay? Matthew 26:23, the one having dipped the hand with me in the dish, he will betray me. Again, those are kind of like literalistic translations from the Greek of what I think is the same saying in the Synoptics. Now, the idea seems to be that this is Jesus' sign of who's going to betray him, that it's someone who dips at the same time with him in the bowl, and that's Jesus being sort of passive and waiting for Judas to dip at the same time that he does in the bowl, and that accomplishes the sign, and that this is then in contrast with John, where Jesus dips and hands it to Judas. So which of these, are we to think really happened, if either? Who knows? Think too about the lameness, again, and the psychological lack of realism in saying that it's, passive to to predict that someone who dips his hand with you in the bowl is the one who's betraying you. I mean, if that is a sign, it shows Jesus, knowledge of what's happening. The whole thing is just completely strained. Like, oh, it's this sign in the synoptics, but he's just sitting there, whereas in John, he's handing it to him. It's just an attempt to look for some way, however implausible, to say that Jesus is more active and more taking charge in John. Now, as a matter of fact, I don't think this is meant to be a special sign in the synoptics at all, which is one reason why I don't see any conflict between the synoptics and John on this. I think Jesus is just making the general statement, because several people would be dipping, and you've got this bowl in the middle, and they're dipping into it. I don't think it's a sign at all. Just think about it. If Jesus said, hey, the one who's going to dip at the same time that I dip in the bowl, he's the one who's going to betray me, everybody'd sit on their hands, right? I'm not going to dip at the same time Jesus is dipping. That's good. People will think I'm the one who's going to betray him. So I don't think Jesus is saying, hey, everybody, wait for it. It's a guy, are we ready? Somebody want to dip with me at the same time? No, of course not. I think this is just a way of saying that it is one of the 12, and I think that's most apparent in the wording in Mark. And also in Luke. In other words, that it's one of his close disciples, one of these intimate people who's right there on that night eating with him, and here they are, they're dipping in the bowl, same bowl together, and so forth. Not that it's a special sign that they're supposed to be looking for. So this whole thing is wrong from the start. Okay, what's another one of the supposed indications of development? Well, there's no Simon of Cyrene carrying Jesus' cross in the Gospel of John, and it doesn't mention that they made someone else carry his cross. Of course, historically, we know that they did make prisoners carry that big crossbeam. So it's very likely, antecedently, that Jesus as a crucifixion victim would be made to carry that crossbeam originally. And then they didn't want him to die on the way. So when he keeps, being unable to handle it, they conscript Simon of Cyrene to carry it. But that's not in John. So then this is supposed to indicate some kind of, like John's upplaying the length of road over which Jesus carries his cross, and downplaying, suppressing any involvement of anybody else, because he's going forth in obedience to the Father, bearing his own cross, and that shows him as more in control of his own death. I swear I am not making this up. Now, again, we're trying here to make common sense rigorous. That's the tagline of this channel. And let's think about this, just like we thought about the supposed sign of waiting for somebody to dip his hand with him. Would it show Jesus as being more in control, for him to carry his cross further rather than less far? I submit to you that anybody who says that lacks imagination, and for sure has never witnessed an actual crucifixion. Well, I haven't witnessed an actual crucifixion, but I try to use my imagination in the best of senses. Forcing crucifixion victims to carry their crosses was not a Roman practice for the purpose of giving them control over their own deaths. It was part of the torture. It was brutal. It was cruel. It was part of the horror of it. And you're going to carry your own cross, to which we're then going to nail you up, and then you're going to hang there till you die. This is brutal. This has nothing to do with being in control of your own death. You're beaten and bloody. So picturing Jesus as carrying his crossbeam, whether for the whole way out to Golgotha, which I think John knew perfectly well, he didn't carry it all the way, or for a portion of the way until he can't do it anymore and they get Simon of Cyrene to come in. Either way, nobody who really had experienced a crucifixion would ever say, whoa, cool symbolism of being in control of your own death. That, again, is really, really strained. I submit to you that neither John nor any of his readers would have thought of it that way. Hey, look, John didn't mention Simon of Cyrene. Look how obedient and in control, carrying his own cross Jesus is in John. Maybe even all the way to the cross. No. That is a modern affectation. That is a literary approach to the Gospels that's completely out of touch with, if I may so say, ancient reality and the reality of crucifixion and the surrounding tortures. So this again shows the strained attempt to find some way in which John is more developed. Going back briefly to the business about Jesus handing the sop to Judas, John explicitly says that he begins to be very troubled and distressed in spirit. So again, this isn't him just being calm, cool, and collected. Okay, now I want to move to the attempt to explain away counter evidence. As we talked about last time, a big piece of counter evidence, among others, but a really big one, is that only in John, which is the last of the Gospels, does Jesus express physical suffering from the cross. He says, I'm thirsty. That's only in John. We find scholars unable to shoehorn this into their development theory because it doesn't fit in their development theory. So then they've got to find some way of explaining it away. Here's what Bart Ehrman does. Ehrman says, this is in an NPR discussion, and the transcript of it is online, that John tells us that Jesus said, I thirst, but not because he was actually thirsty, that he said it to fulfill the scriptures. Now, John does say that he said it to fulfill the scriptures, that the scripture might be fulfilled. But John never says that he didn't say it also because he was actually thirsty. Again, little real world understanding, dehydration would definitely have been part of the suffering of crucifixion. He's been beaten brutally, and he's lost a lot of blood. He's been hanging on the cross. Of course, we don't even know if anybody's given him anything to drink since they arrested him in the garden the night before. So this is just a misrepresentation of John. John doesn't say that he didn't say it because he was thirsty. And so this is Ehrman's sort of lame attempt to get away from the very human implications of that expression, because Ehrman wants to portray Jesus in John as being quite different from Jesus in Mark, and it just doesn't work. Okay, so then here's another attempt to explain away this inconvenient evidence. We find this in Daniel Wallace. And this is a view that Dr. Licona picked up from Dr. Wallace and made public in his book, Why Are There Differences in the Gospels? So this theory is that Jesus did not recognizably say, I am thirsty, when he was on the cross, in a way where if you'd been there, you would have heard him say, please give me some water, or I am thirsty, or water, or, something like that, indicating actual physical thirst. Instead, he said, my God, why have you forsaken me? We find this in the Synoptics, and John turned this into, I am thirsty, and John even shows someone coming immediately after that and offering him wine. So it's very clear that it's being portrayed in John as something that the people could actually hear him say, expressing thirst. But this is just supposed to be John's sort of secret code for, my God, why have you forsaken me? And let me make something clear here. There is not supposed to be any tag in the text to say, psst, by the way, this didn't really historically happen. This really meant, my God, why have you forsaken me? There's nothing like that. On the contrary, John makes it look quite literal. And the arguments for this are just completely lacking. The one that Dr. Licona mentions is that other places in John, Jesus uses thirst in a metaphoric sense, like when he says, if anyone is thirsty, let him come unto me and drink. Well, okay, but how does that mean that he probably always used it in a metaphoric sense? He probably never really said, I'm thirsty. I mean, that's lame. That's really lame. And in Dr. Wallace's paper, it becomes very clear that this is like a priori reasoning. Dr. Wallace even mentions in that paper that some people have said to him, hey, it's not unlikely that Jesus would say he was thirsty because he was being crucified, what I just pointed out, right? And then he says, but the question is this likely in John? And it's like, well, it's there in John. I mean, you can't get away from the fact that, Jesus says it in John, okay? So he says, because the cross is Jesus' glorification in John, so then the idea, which it almost gives you a cramp in the brain to try to really lay this out, but the idea is that John put something in there that didn't happen recognizably, that he knows didn't happen recognizably, which he didn't have to put in, nobody was making him put it in, that looks like Jesus is physically suffering. But Jesus actually physically suffering doesn't fit with his themes. So John, makes himself feel good about his themes by secretly and without any notion or notice in the text, in his own mind, knowing that this didn't really happen and thinking of it as a symbolic reference to spiritual thirst and as a transformation of, my God, why have you forsaken me? Now, that is so roundabout that, as I say, it ought to give you a cramp in the brain. After all, if expressing physical thirst doesn't fit with John's themes, all he has to do is not have Jesus appear to express physical thirst, right? Or have him say, my God, why have you forsaken me? Or just leave that particular saying out and have him say nothing at that point, or whatever. But for him to invent, and this is inventing, let's not use misleading euphemisms like paraphrase. I thirst is not a paraphrase of my God, why have you forsaken me? If you think it is, you're not expressing things clearly. For him to make it up unnecessarily and then sort of reconcile that in his own mind with his themes by secretly meaning something spiritual by it. That is so weird. But what this again means is that a priori notion of development, that Jesus in John is his cross is his glorification and he's more in control and all of this, that's in the driver's seat. That's driving the bus, not the actual data of the text. And so when the data of the text contradict the development theory, then we just turn ourselves into pretzels to come up with some wildly ad hoc theory to try to reconcile it with the development theory, even something that, as in this case of I thirst and my God, why have you forsaken me, doesn't make sense even taken on its own terms. So I want you to see that because it's so easy when we're talking about people with the degrees, people who are the experts, to say to oneself, well, what do I know? Maybe Jesus does become more and more exalted in his death, more and more in control, less and less suffering as we move from Mark, Matthew, Luke to John throughout the Gospels. And what I'm trying to show you here is that these theories are all bunk, no matter who brings them forward. So if you thought it sounded weird, you were right. And if you didn't realize it sounded weird, now you should. And come back next time because we'll move on to another alleged development theory. I haven't decided which one yet. And start debunking that one here at the Lydia Magruder channel, where we're making common sense rigorous.